Kirk Cousins apparently has regrets about coming to Atlanta. Kirk, get in line.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades. Formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong for almost a full decade here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we'll be talking about how Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris are going to mix up that special sauce by blending their coverages and defensive philosophies together and how that might look. We'll talk about Tristan Wirfs being out for week 1 potentially and what that means for the Falcons pass rush, as well as the beginning of the Bucs season. But of course, you know, now that we've all had time to digest the new Netflix quarterback documentary series that highlighted Jared Goff, Joe Burrow, and of course, Kirk Cousins, give you my thoughts on watching it. I enjoyed it. Highly recommend other people to watch it. You know, you get a nice behind the scenes look at some of the top quarterbacks in the NFL, including Kirk Cousins. And obviously the big sort of things emerging about Kirk Cousins were kind of 2 quotes, right? On one being on his decision to come to Atlanta and some regrets on that. Other being sort of surrounding him playing through some injuries and the decision that went into that. And we have some tweets from our guy, Monarch Money of ESPN that, you know, perfectly summarize those quotes. In the first one on Kirk's decision to come to Atlanta, he said, I quote, "Certainly if I had the information around free agency, it certainly would have affected my decision. I had no reason to leave Minnesota with how much we loved it there if both teams are going to be drafting a quarterback high. But I've also learned in 12 years in this league that you're not entitled to anything. It's all about being able to earn your spot and prove yourself." And on playing through injuries late in the season, Kirk quoted as, "The information I had at the time, I made the best decision. You also know that if you sit down week 10 and take 2 or 3 weeks or more to let it heal, you may never get your job back. I remember reading Drew Brees' book back in 2010 when he first wrote it, how he made the point that he tried to never let his backup see the field, even if it was somebody who was really no threat. He just felt like you should never do that. Doug Flutie taught him that." And I've seen some reactions to these quotes, rather overreactions, some might say, online. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday on the podcast. I'm not particularly mad in the slightest at Kirk Cousins for any of these statements. You know, as I said yesterday, you know, I get it with Kirk. I wish the Falcons had been a little bit more forthcoming with their draft plans with Kirk, because basically he's saying that he left Minnesota because, you know, he didn't want to be on a year-to-year plan, you know, looking over his shoulder, worrying about, you know, that first-round pick coming for his job. And Minnesota was very upfront with like, hey, Kirk, we're willing to commit 1 more year to you, but beyond that, who knows? And he knows that with that first-round pick, you know, being drafted, ultimately JJ McCarthy, you know, the minute he goes into a slump, he's losing his job. And so the Vikings were very upfront with drafting his potential replacement. The Falcons were not. And had they been, as I said on yesterday's episode, like I think they would have saved Kirk Cousins, the team, and all of us a lot of headaches. They would have saved themselves a lot of money over that, because Kirk's basically saying that, you know, if those 2 outcomes were the likely, I would have just stayed in Minnesota. You know, with the injury stuff, I've seen, you know, some people being very upset with that because, you know, I've seen some people call him selfish, and I'm like, you know, it's 2025. Are we really getting mad at players for cutting through injuries, right? That's basically the job of being a professional athlete. You know, I certainly have more thoughts on that, but it'll probably conclude with me ranting and raving and complaining about Zach Robinson. I've already done that enough this week. I did go back and look at those 9 picks that Kirk threw in the last 5 games, his last 5 starts today. And, I think it's why the injury Kirk suffered against the Saints, while it was an issue, I don't think is as big of a problem as it has been made to be since the end of the season, because like 8 of those picks weren't because like Kirk couldn't put enough on the throw because of an injured shoulder and elbow and whatever injuries he was dealing with that he suffered in that Saints game on the hit by Peyton Turner. Most of those picks, like basically all but one of them, were poor decisions, him forcing throws, him and his receivers not being on the same page, him, not living to play another down, right? Rather than him not being able to put enough on the football because he was hurt. And I thought it was notable in the doc that Kirk admitted, when they were talking with him, basically off the timing of the documentary, and how the documentary works, where they film a lot of stuff, and then after the fact, they go back and interview people to give them their thought process during the time. But around the time of after the Chargers game, Kirk admitted on the documentary that he was forcing things, right? He was pressing and he was forcing things. And certainly I think the injury absolutely contributed to that. But, I do feel like that's the part of the conversation that probably deserves more scrutiny. Like, probably the Falcons' decision. Again, I'm not saying that it's Michael Penix's fault or anything like that Kirk was pressing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Kirk is responsible for his own actions. But the Falcons contributed to that by, having Michael Penix breathe down his neck. Now, I know that's not going to get any sympathy among Falcon fans, but I sympathize and empathize with Kirk on that front because, I think many people in his shoes would have felt the same way. But, I know empathy is a hard place to go. But, going back and looking at those 9 interceptions, I couldn't help but notice 3 of them, I'm not going to say are on Zach Robinson, but I don't think the play caller did a good job of putting his quarterback in a position to succeed. And it felt very eerily similar of watching Dirk Cutter all over again. And, part of me is like, I wish people had the same energy to criticize Zach Robinson in 2025 like they had to criticize Dirk Cutter in 2020, because it's the same thing. It's the same picture from The Office and whatnot. So, that was another thing that kind of stood out about this doc. Like Ben Johnson certainly got his love in terms of his contributions to Jared Goff's success in it. But we will leave that aside. And I highly recommend folks to check out the documentary if you haven't already watched it. I think it's less than 6 hours to binge through it. I've enjoyed both seasons of the quarterback show that we've had this summer and the previous summer, including the Marcus Mariota stuff. I didn't watch the receiver last summer, but I feel compelled at some point, probably on a weekend, to binge that between now and the start of the season. Let's talk about what's, instead of talking about, arguing about Kirk Cousins, let's argue about what should be next on our Netflix queue. I got Old Guard 2. I got to watch season 4 of Love, Death, and Robots. Drop some recs in the comments. What's on your Netflix queue and whatnot. And hopefully we won't be spending too much time still arguing and debating about Kirk Cousins stemming from 2024, and we can just focus on what Kirk is going to contribute to this team in 2025, which is being the best backup quarterback and the most expensive backup quarterback. But we won't focus on that part. In the NFL, we're getting what we're paid for, right? The best backup quarterback in the NFL. You got to pay a premium for backup quarterbacks, right? In today's NFL. And hopefully the Falcons will do a better job keeping their new starting quarterback from suffering any injuries in Michael Penix. And hopefully they will do the opposite with, not injuring quarterbacks, but getting opposing quarterbacks on the ground, including one Baker Mayfield. And speaking of that, the Falcons kind of got some good news on that front, because Tristan Wirfs seems like he's very likely to miss the early part of the season, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, we love summer sports, don't we? Right? And just because the NBA season is over and the NFL season has yet to begin doesn't mean FanDuel isn't still the best way to get in all the action of the baseball, soccer, golf, tennis, WNBA, NBA Summer League that is going strong all summer long. And if you're already following the action, why not make it a little bit more thrilling with FanDuel? And whether you want to check out the Braves, Hawks, Falcons, or you want to get buckets with Page Buckets, FanDuel is going to give you every opportunity, whether it's picking when Ronald Acuna is going to hit his next homer, if the Hawks are going to win the Eastern Conference, the Falcons making a deep playoff run, or, Page Buckets is going to drop 20 on Wednesday night against the Chicago Sky and Angel Reese. right? And the thing we love about FanDuel, it's fast to pay out. It's easy to use. So why wait? Go sign up at FanDuel. And if you're new customers can get $150 in bonus bets by betting just $5. And if that first $5 bet wins, again, that's $150 in bonus bets. When your first $5 bet wins, open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. So according to Rick Stroud of the Tampa Bay Times, Tristan Wirfs will likely miss the first few games of the upcoming regular season due to recovering from a recent surgery on his right knee earlier this week. It was an aggravation of an injury he suffered back in the 2024 season, and clearly the Bucs were hoping that it would heal on itself, and they, did a scope and saw that there were some other issues. And so he's going to probably go on the PUP list, the physically unable to perform list, at the start of the Bucs training camp later this month, which if he does not come off of that list by the end of training camp, so that they don't see significant progress on his recovery between now and the start of regular season, that probably means he'll be on the PUP list to start the regular season, which means he'll miss at least the first 4 games, which includes the week 1 matchup between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Atlanta Falcons. And that means that the likeliest player to start at left tackle for the Bucs week 1 against the Falcons is going to be their new swing tackle, Charlie Heck, who's replacing Justin School, who was their former swing tackle, who started that week 5 game last year at right tackle and replaced for Luke Gidicke. And Justin School, by the way, was my eye-level comparison for Jack Nelson. Go check that out late last month, that part of the podcast. But Heck played for the Cardinals and 49ers last year after 4 years, I think, with the Texans. Saw some significant action. It's primarily been a right tackle in Houston, but did play some left tackle for the 49ers in the final 2 games last year when Trent Williams and Jalen Moore were out with the lineup, and he kind of platooned with Austin Pleasance, I think was the other tackle that they had. And so this is obviously bad news for the Bucs, but it's great news for the Falcons. As we've been talking all summer long about, this new revamped, new look edge room and upgraded edge room. But, one of the reasons why we haven't been as excited as maybe other people have been is because they still got to face some of the best left tackles in football to start the season, including Tristan Wirfs in week 1, Christian Darrisaw in week 2, Laramie Tunsil in week 4, Deion Dawkins week 6, Trent Williams week 7. 4 of those 5 guys I just named were among the top 8 on PFF's offensive tackle rankings. Dawkins was the one exception. He was ranked 17, but there's 10 other tackles on the Falcons schedule this year that were among the top 32 tackles, according to PFF. And so it's been why we've been a little less enthusiastic hyping up guys like James Pierce and Jalen Walker, getting the 10, 12, 15 sacks that other people have been suggesting that they're going to get, because we know historically, rookie pass rushers don't usually hit the ground running. And when you look at the individual matchups that these guys are going to face with some of these high caliber offensive tackles, particularly early in the season, it's going to make those matchups even harder. And it's not too dissimilar from the situation we saw a decade ago when Vic Beasley was drafted, and he was getting that preseason hype of, getting 10, 15 sacks like we've seen with James Pierce and others. And like, I remember at the time being like, I think you guys maybe need to pump the brakes on the Vic Beasley stuff. But again, crazy, pumping the brakes on hype during the summer. What a outrageous thing to say, right? But back then in 2015, it was like, you looked at the early season schedule, it was like Jason Peters, Lane Johnson, Tyron Smith, Dwayne Brown, Trent Williams, Teron Armstead, Taylor Lewan, Joe Staley, for the most part, that Vic Beasley was facing of the first half of the season. I remember having discussions about like, I don't think Vic Beasley's going to come up, get, rolling, but, in the back half of the season when he's facing like bad offensive tackles or middling offensive, like Donovan Smith, shout out to Donovan Smith, my arch nemesis, when he faces those guys, he's going to eat, so, when it comes to Tristan Wirfs, we wish Tristan Wirfs a very healthy recovery, but take your sweet time, right? Tristan, if you're listening, make sure you don't come back until you're not just 100%, but we're talking like 130%. We want you back better than ever, and however long it takes for you to get back to that, right? And, and if that takes not just the first 4 games, but, the first 8 games or more, I would say 15 because we play the Bucs again in week 15. But like, again, I know that's probably not realistic, but, it's in your best interest to take your time, right? Not just sit out the Falcons game in week 1, but, subsequent weeks, you got the Texans, the Jets, the Eagles, right? Some formidable pass rushers. You don't want to come back against those teams and get exposed. Right. Then you got the Seahawks, the 49ers, the Lions, right? Nick Bosa and Aiden Hutchinson. Like, no, you want to make sure that you don't come back anything then better than ever to face some of those premier pass rushers. So take your sweet time. And, if the Bucs falter during that time and get off to a slow start because, with a healthy Tristan Wirfs, they have one of the best offensive lines in football. But without him, they go into a slide or whatever, given that Tristan Wirfs is arguably the best offensive tackle in the NFL, Tristan, that's not your fault, right? Do right by yourself. Learn from Kirk Cousins' mistakes, right? Just sit yourself for an extra month or two if you can, right? Don't try to gut it out. Don't go out there and try to do your job and be Mr. Toughness. You're getting paid $28 million a year. Just take it easy. Relax, Tristan. So, if you're listening, Tristan, please take our advice on that front. So we'll see how that impacts that week 1 matchup, but certainly much more optimistic, at least for week 1, that this Falcons pass rush is going to get home. And so we'll see what's what on that in the months to come. And, speaking of the Falcons pass rush, I want to talk more about this special blend of marrying the Jeff Ulbrich scheme with the Raheem Moore scheme and what that means and sort of what are the trends going to be. And we'll get into that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So if you missed it last week, we did 2 episodes, I believe on Thursday and Friday, breaking down, some of the hallmarks of the Jeff Ulbrich Jets 4-3 over wide 9 attacking scheme that Jeff Ulbrich is likely to bring to Atlanta. And I got a comment on one of those videos. I believe it was the Friday episode when we kind of broke down, how the 4-3 over stack defense was going to impact the linebackers and lead to more man coverage and, maybe some more box safety play. Shout out to DeMarco Helms. We'll talk more about him probably next week as sort of the under the radar third safety this upcoming season, but that'll be a topic of discussion probably next week when we get into our positional breakdowns of the defense ahead of training camp. That's the plan at least. But that comment came from ATL Grio. He said Morris has not stated that, and neither has Ulbrich. Anyway, they've said there'll be multiple, and referencing sort of the discussion around what this defense is going to look like in the scheme and whatnot. And so, I feel like this is worth at least talking about a little bit on today's episode, just because I've been watching quite a bit of Jets film over the past week or so in preparation for a film breakdown that I plan to do for the Locked On Falcons Insiders at the end of the week, breaking down the differences in the Falcon scheme. And I'll plug that a little bit later. But I do want to touch upon what ATL Grio was saying in terms of the multiplicity. The Jets were multiple. They did run different fronts, but they were overwhelmingly like a 4-3 over front. And I don't have the exact numbers, and I'll probably have it closer to the exact numbers when I do that film breakdown once I'm done with the film. But at least based off my film study so far, like let's imagine hypothetically, you have about 63 plays in a game where you're going to call it a defense. The Jets were in something other than a 4-3 over, or really probably more accurately a 4-2 over front, just because of the preponderance of nickel defense, for maybe 5 out of those 63 plays. And so technically they were multiple, right? Because they are in multiple fronts, right? Occasionally they're in a 4-3 under front. Occasionally they're in a 3-4 front. Occasionally they'll throw out a 6-1 front or a 5-1 penny front or whatever the sort of thing. But relatively speaking, we're talking about 90% of the time over the course of an NFL game, they're overwhelmingly in that wide 9 4-3 over stack front that we were discussing last week. And so, when I think Jeff Ulbrich says we're going to be multiple, I mean, he's meaning it really on the sort of pedantic technical level of we're going to play multiple fronts because we're going to do more than one thing every now and then, but probably 90% of the time they're going to be in that 4-3 over front. Now, I could be wrong on that, and the Falcons may wind up blending their fronts and being more hybrid and, sometimes dabbling with a 4-man front versus a 5-man front and all that stuff. But my response to ATL Grio on that video in the comments was, the context clues kind of tell us that that's probably not going to be the case. But again, maybe I'm wrong. And, those context clues I'm referring to are Nate Ollie's background, the addition of Walker and Pierce being undersized edge rushers, not adding a wide body nose tackle, and the comments that Jeff Ulbrich has made multiple times about simplifying the defense. Now, when we look at Nate Ollie's background, when we look at where Nate Ollie has coached, whether it's Philadelphia, the Jets, Indianapolis, Houston, those teams were predominantly 4-3 over front. when we talk about Walker and Pierce being undersized edge rushers, I think when you play a wide 9, you can probably get away with lighter edges than you would in the other 4-3 fronts where you typically want to play with light boxes, which the Jets do typically play with. But when you want to play with light boxes, as so many teams do nowadays, you typically want to get bigger on at edge, similar to what the Falcons did when Ryan Nielsen was around, where, as we've joked many times, like if you weren't 265 pounds, Ryan Nielsen wants nothing to do with you, right? Ryan Nielsen would be like, ill, gross, get James Pierce away from me, get Jalen Walker away from me, gross, I don't like them, right? And, not having a wide body nose tackle, you can play with lighter edges in a 3-4 defense, but, then you traditionally would in a 4-3 defense. But the fact that the Falcons didn't add a single wide body this offseason, to me, is very telling that they're not planning on playing a 3-4. And I know some people have been like, well, reportedly Laquelle London's bulked up to 330 pounds. But it would just be super weird to me that the Falcons were like putting all their eggs in the Laquelle London basket of playing, 20% of the snaps that you typically would associate with a nose tackle in a, 3-4 base defense, like Eddie Goldman played last year, for a player in Laquelle London that didn't even make the roster last year. Right. It would be weird for me for the Falcons to be like, yeah, we are super confident in Laquelle London when it's like he couldn't even make the team last year, And then when we talk about simplifying the defense, sort of playing more man coverage, like, again, it's all leading to the Falcons adopting more of what the Jets are doing than, what they were doing before. Now, again, I personally don't think it's that much of a mystery what the Falcons are going to do from a front standpoint. And again, if you want to get more insight into that, go check out last Thursday and Friday's episodes, where we go more over the 4-3 over front and sort of the core tenets of that and that wide 9 stuff in more detail. But to me, I think when we talk about how are they going to blend this defense, and multiplicity doesn't really refer to the coverages, but I think in this context, it's worthwhile bringing up how are they going to blend their coverages? How is Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris going to take this Saleh Ulbrich style defense, Shanahan style defense? That's our guest Cody Alexander, Match Quarters, called it, a couple of months ago when he was on the podcast, versus the Morris style defense that is more from the Staley Fangio coaching tree. And as I've said in the past, fronts don't matter because everybody's running hybrid fronts, everybody's being multiple and whatnot. And really what distinguishes defenses from each other is really their coverage shells. Although, I said that before, and I feel like now the notable difference is like the wide 9 front is relatively distinct from a front standpoint. So fronts do matter if you're running a wide 9 front. Everybody else that's not running a wide 9 front, they don't matter that much. But that's basically my more nuanced take now. But when you look at the coverage shells that the Jets were running based off of my film study and some of the other data that's out there, they were a defense that primarily majored in cover 1, man coverage, cover 3, cover 4, right? And they dabbled in cover 6. And the other thing that stood out to me watching the film, and the data suggests, the Jets didn't do a lot of pre-snap and post-snap disguise, right? You can pretty much tell, and I'll be curious as I watch more games, particularly with the difference between when Saleh was the head coach and when Ulbrich was the interim head coach, because I haven't seen enough games yet to form this. But like I noticed in one of the early games that Jeff Ulbrich was the interim head coach, they did like no disguise. They did a little bit with Saleh, but it was like no disguise, like under Jeff Ulbrich. So they really simplified the defense. It was like, we're dumbing this down to the point that like within 2 seconds of walking to the line of scrimmage, the quarterback knows what coverage is going to be. But you contrast those tendencies with what the Falcons were doing, where they mostly majored in cover 3, right? Now, the Falcons also dabbled in cover 1. They dabbled in cover 2, cover 4, and cover 6, right? And they were one of the teams that disguised the most in the NFL, often presenting too high and then rotating into that cover 3, which was their major coverage. But they would, mix things up. You very often would not get the same look pre-snap, post-snap in terms of what the safeties were doing as a way to sort of confuse quarterbacks and just get them thinking that extra half a second of being like, what exactly am I seeing, to hopefully force them to hold on to the ball so that the pass rush can get home. And so based off of my charting from last year of the Falcons defense, about a third of the time they played cover 3. And then when you look at those other 4 coverages of cover 1, cover 2, cover 4, and cover 6, they between about 10 and 15% of the time. So that made up about over 90% of the coverages that they played last season. So it was about an even split between cover 1, cover 2, cover 4, and cover 6, right? And then based off my charting so far, and seeing some of the other data about the Jets, they play about 80% of the time. They're in cover 1, cover 3, or cover 4, and it's roughly like an even split. It's like between 20 and 30% for all three of those coverages in terms of what they're doing in terms of cover 1, cover 3, and then like another 15% of the time they're in cover 6, and then 5% other, right? Which is mostly cover 2 and other things. And so like when we're talking about, play calling, as we've talked about before with Zach Robinson, referring to play calling as like spices and seasonings, right? And what we're talking about now with defense is like each sort of coverage is like a different flavor, right? To all bring it together to make a different sauce or a different stew or whatever. And you can make a sauce that is more leaning on, spicy flavors or sweet flavors or umami or whatever the case may be, depending on how you blend these different coverage shells sort of together. And to me is where I think not necessarily the fronts, but really where the coverage shells are going to be is where the interesting conversation to me is, and debate and discussion is on how Ulbrich and Morris are going to kind of blend these things together. And does it all come together to make something delicious, or is it more of like a motley concoction that we're like, I don't know if it came together? Like I'm reminded of, and I don't know if you guys did this when you were kids, but I remember in elementary school where you'd be sitting at lunch, and at the end of lunch, some kid would have like milk left over, and I'm going to put all types of nonsense in the milk, like ketchup and all this nonsense. And then you're like, I'm going to dare you to drink it. And then like, what are you going to give me? You know how little kids are. Again, maybe little kids are a little different nowadays, but just utter nonsense. And like, that's what I'm imagining where you're trying to blend all this stuff together and it doesn't work is basically what I'm saying. Like that's the extreme version of it not working and blending together. So when I'm thinking about this and I'm making an educated guess on how it's all going to try to blend together, again, because both of these defenses majored in cover 3, I think that's going to be a staple, right? But I think what you're going to see is more of the disguise that we saw with Raheem's defense last year than this sort of simple, what you see is what you get defense that we saw with the Jets in Ulbrich last year. And I think that's going to be kind of the foundation that Raheem has already established as like the base of the sauce, right? The roux of the sauce, if you're following my analogy here. I know some of you guys are like, Aaron, of course you love talking about sauces and food. And it's like, yep, I'm not going to lie about that. But, it's going to be interesting to see what different flavors, Ulbrich's going to bring. And I think the main one is going to be more of that man coverage, because as we discussed last week, as we saw in the back half of 2024 with the Falcons, they dialed up more man coverage in the second half of the season. And it seemed to be that the defense responded in a very positive way. And I don't see any reason why why Raheem would reverse course on that and be like, we're just going to go back to a zone heavy scheme again. And it's like, again, I don't think they're going to be like the Jets were when it comes to man coverage, but I'm thinking like probably something closer to league average when it comes to man coverage. Whereas like the Falcons last year were like bottom 3, I think, according to certain data in terms of man coverage usage, according to other people. And then the Jets were like top 10. And so I think if you blend those two things together, the perfect blend is like, I don't know, what, like 15th or something like that, 18th or something like that in terms of man coverage usage. So that to me is where I kind of expect them to be when it comes to that. And, I also think Ulbrich is going to bring more cover 4 to the table, and that's going to, that flavor is going to get pushed more to the front. But I also think, Raheem is going to have his cover 6 stuff that's going in, or technically cover 8 sort of blend that they would also do as well, which, cover 6, cover 8, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of the differences between it, but, it's like, it's which side of the field has, when you have cover 6, right, where you have quarter, half is what cover 6 is. And it's which side of the field is the half. Is it the strong side or the weak side? And that determines whether it's technically called cover 6 or cover 8. But we'll just lump it all in cover 6 because ultimately it doesn't really matter to any of us, in terms of that. But, I think how they blend these flavors, how much do they sprinkle in the cover 4 versus cover 6 versus the man coverage versus disguise and all these various things that I think are coming. That to me is where I think it's going to be an interesting topic to sort of see. And I think, but again, that's my sort of educated guess based off of what I've seen in terms of what the Falcons are going to do. And I know, only probably about 10% of you guys really care about the nitty gritty of the defensive scheme. The other 90% are just like, hey, does it work? That's all I really care about. And again, not to be condescending or anything like that, but but for that 10% of you that are really invested in what exactly the scheme is going to be, those are kind of, I think, where the bullet points are going to be. So we'll see on that front, but we'll have more insight into that, certainly for the Locked On Falcons insiders. And my goal is to look at 4 common opponents between the Jets and Falcons from this past year, compare and contrast how the Falcons and Jets played those teams. And I'm thinking about adding a 5th opponent that the Falcons are going to be facing this upcoming season to sort of see what it is. And I'm shooting for that breakdown to be available come Saturday. So make sure you sign up at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons to become a Locked On Falcons insider. You can get that breakdown for free, 14-day free trial. You can get my breakdown last week of the differences between Zach Robinson and Liam Cohen schemes in terms of how they use 2 running backs and the tight end, as well as any upcoming breakdowns that I will have in the coming weeks and months, as well as the extended all 22 reviews later this season. That's all available for you. 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month after that point at the link in the description. So join the Locked On Falcons insiders. If you want to continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen, we should be back tomorrow with Jarvis Davis. I'm sure he'll have some thoughts on Kirk Cousins, Tristan Wirfs, and whatever other nonsense Jarvis and I will get up into. And so make sure you check out Locked On Falcons your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Hawks, Locked On NFL Scouting. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.